The news cameras have packed up. With Maduro now in New York, the airstrikes are memory, and the press conference is finished, you might think the story is over. But the real narrative is only now coming into focus, because what unfolded in Venezuela was never an isolated event. Greenland, the Panama Canal, Canada, Venezuela, these are not separate issues. They're all linked by a single strategic logic that most of the mainstream analysis is failing to see. This has nothing to do with one man being put in custody. It has everything to do with securing resources, dominating trade arteries, and making strategic plays for the future. The administration labels it a matter of national security. Its critics call it economic warfare, but whatever term you use, the playbook is identical. You seize the supply chains, you dictate the pricing mechanisms, and you lock your competitors out of the market. Today, I'm going to lay out the economic calculus that is driving events across the Western Hemisphere. We're not talking about politics or personalities. We are talking about the fundamental structural power moves that are re-engineering energy markets and the global order. Three things are paramount right now: the world's oil reserves and who holds the keys, the flow of currency and the system that prices it, and the relentless expansion of China's economic power into territories the United States has long considered its own. Let me show you what the real board looks like. South America is now an economic war zone. Here is the crucial piece of the puzzle that most coverage ignores. The situation in Venezuela was not a spontaneous crisis, it was one calculated move in a continent-wide economic conflict that has been intensifying for 20 years. In 2024, trade between China and Latin America surpassed $518 billion. That is not a typo, more than $500 billion, and that figure is growing by nearly 30% a year. 2 decades ago, China was responsible for less than 2% of all exports from Latin America. Today, Beijing is South America's #1 trading partner. Brazil's biggest partner isn't the United States, it's China. The same is true for Peru. The same is true for Chile. Ecuador just finalized a free trade agreement with Beijing in 2024. Nicaragua did the same. 22 out of 33 nations across Latin America and the Caribbean are now signed onto China's Belt and Road Initiative. This goes far beyond trade statistics. This is about concrete and steel. Chinese firms now either own or have operational control of major port facilities in Peru, Brazil, Panama, and Ecuador. The brand new port of Chancay in Peru, which just became operational, was specifically built to ship exports from 6 different South American countries directly to markets in Asia, effectively designing the United States out of the logistics equation. So when you think about Venezuela, you have to understand this larger context. The United States is witnessing its traditional sphere of influence pivot economically toward Beijing, and that pivot isn't an abstract theory. It's ports, it's railways, it's massive energy contracts, and it's new payment infrastructures. For Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Latin America is his entire portfolio. It is his primary focus and his area of expertise. And his strategic objective could not be clearer: to re-establish American economic dominance in the hemisphere, but to do so without triggering a full-scale military occupation. Venezuela serves as the warning shot. It's a message that says if you drift too close to China, if you pose a threat to the dollar's role in pricing energy, if you let yourself become a key link in Beijing's global supply chain, you will face the consequences. This is not regime change in the way we traditionally think of it. This is a forced market correction. And that brings us to the oil denomination problem. Now we get to the heart of the matter. This isn't about oil volume, it's about oil currency. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, estimated at around 300 billion barrels, and yet its ability to produce that oil has completely collapsed. Under Maduro's leadership, output cratered from more than 3 million barrels a day to less than 1 million. The country's infrastructure fell into ruin, investment vanished, and the skilled labor fled. So if Venezuela is barely pumping any oil, why is it so strategically critical? Because this isn't about controlling current production, it's about controlling its future. Here is how the system works. For 50 years, the world's oil has been priced and sold in US dollars. That system, often called the Petrodollar, generates an enormous built-in demand for American currency. Any country on Earth that needs to import oil must first get its hands on US dollars. That global demand is what allows the United States to borrow enormous sums cheaply to print currency without suffering the immediate inflationary blowback, and to finance its debt with much lower interest rates than its economic fundamentals would justify. But that system is now fracturing. Saudi Arabia has declined to renew its decades-long agreement to exclusively use the dollar. The BRICS nations, which include Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are shifting more and more of their energy deals into their own local currencies, or the Yuan. And all the intelligence suggested Venezuela was on the brink of a major shift. They were preparing to plug their energy sector directly into Beijing's international payment network and begin pricing their oil in a collection of currencies dominated by the yuan. Had that plan gone through, China could have purchased Venezuelan crude without ever touching a single dollar. If China no longer needs a massive dollar reserve, global demand for American currency plummets. When demand plummets, the dollar's value collapses. When the dollar collapses, the expense of financing America's national debt goes into overdrive. This is the existential threat. Not that Venezuela might sell 1 million barrels a day to the Chinese, but that a nation sitting on 300 billion barrels of reserves would prove to the world that it's possible to price oil outside the US financial system and survive. That was the precedent Washington was determined to prevent, which is why the government was targeted for removal. Trump was remarkably candid about this during a press conference. He described how US energy firms would move and overhaul the infrastructure and then extract the country's wealth. He specified the oil would be sent to other nations, and also to the United States as a form of reimbursement for damages. Rubio performed damage control the following day, insisting the US doesn't require Venezuelan crude, and claiming this was about good governance, not about resources. But that very contradiction exposes the entire strategy. Trump blurts out the raw operational goal. Rubio is tasked with managing the diplomatic consequences. The actual truth is somewhere in that gap. The United States may not require Venezuelan oil for its own use today, but it absolutely requires control over that oil. It must ensure that those vast reserves continue to be traded in dollars. It must stop China from building a self-sufficient energy supply chain that exists beyond the American financial framework. This was never about liberating Venezuela. The mission was about shackling it back into the dollar system and setting the board for the next global move. Now we get to the layer that the majority of analysts seem to overlook. This is not merely about the current oil market. This is about maneuvering for a pre-conflict advantage. I am not claiming war with China is around the corner. I am claiming the United States is consolidating power in its own hemisphere in preparation for such a conflict. Observe the pattern, exerting trade pressure on Canada, floating rhetoric about Greenland and its mineral deposits, a renewed interest in the Panama Canal and who governs the shipping arteries, and now a direct intervention in Venezuela. These actions all follow a single strategic logic: solidify your backyard, command critical supply routes, and block your adversaries from getting a foothold on the resources and infrastructure of the Western Hemisphere. Before you challenge a peer competitor, you secure your rear flank, you guarantee your energy supplies are stable, you confirm your trade routes are protected, and you make sure your neighbors cannot offer a strategic advantage to your rival. Venezuela slots perfectly into that calculation. The objective isn't to pick a fight with the current regime, it's to guarantee that if tensions with Beijing escalate, the largest oil reserves in South America cannot become an energy lifeline for the Chinese. This is strategic. Preparation, securing physical assets, locking down contracts and controlling the insurance and logistics networks, long before they might be needed in a full-blown crisis. The public narrative, of course, is framed differently. The administration invokes the Monroe Doctrine, speaks of national security, and casts its actions as a defense of the hemisphere. That messaging connects with the American electorate. It sounds decisive, strong, and protective, but the strategy beneath the surface is economic containment, specifically preventing China from achieving independent access to essential resources and using military power to enforce that policy when economic coercion is not enough. What does this do to prices and markets? So how does this translate for the actual markets? For the price of oil, for the cost of gasoline at the pump? In the immediate future, very little. Venezuela's current output has dropped so low under 1 million barrels per day that taking it off the market entirely doesn't budge the needle. OPEC has surplus capacity. American shale can increase production. The market simply absorbs the shock. But markets don't simply trade on current supply, they trade on expectations for the future. And the clear expectation here is that American oil corporations will eventually enter Venezuela, reconstruct the dilapidated infrastructure and bring its production roaring back to life. If that comes to pass, if Venezuela's output climbs back to 3 million barrels per day over the coming decade, that introduces a massive new supply of heavy crude, which is perfectly suited for the refineries on the Gulf Coast. Priced in dollars, and it's a scenario that energy markets have already begun to factor in. The street is now anticipating a wave of renegotiated contracts and the easing of sanctions for specific key operators, along with privileged access for American corporations. But this entire outlook hinges on a massive risk: the task of rebuilding Venezuela's oil. Infrastructure is a monumental undertaking that will require years and tens of billions of dollars, and it's entirely dependent on political stability. If the nation descends into civil conflict, if the new transitional government can't establish its own legitimacy, or if armed resistance movements begin sabotaging operations, then none of that projected investment will ever materialize. In essence, the markets are betting entirely on a best-case outcome: a seamless political handover, a cooperative new government, and a lightning-fast reconstruction of the country's infrastructure. That is a highly optimistic forecast. For consumers, the price of gasoline isn't going to drop overnight. Prices at the pump typically trail the crude oil markets by several weeks, if not months, and the effects will differ from region to region. Refineries along the Gulf Coast stand to gain the most and first. Other areas will likely see far smaller benefits. The psychological effect, however, may ultimately outweigh the economic one. We're talking about the mere perception of energy security, a renewed sense of American control over the energy supply, and a feeling of reduced dependence on Middle Eastern oil. That perception has the power to shape policy and influence voter attitudes, even if the actual savings at the pump are negligible. Now let's pivot to Europe and its role in applying financial pressure. Because while the military component played out in Venezuela, the economic campaign is being waged from European capitals. Governments across Europe have moved to freeze the Venezuelan state's assets. Banks have been officially warned to apply heavy scrutiny to all related transactions. Insurance underwriters are reassessing their coverage for any shipping linked to Venezuela. Together, these actions establish financial choke points that are just as powerful as the military blockade. If you cannot get insurance on a tanker, then you cannot ship oil. If you're unable to process payments through the European banking system, your contracts are worthless. If your capital is frozen in a vault in London or Frankfurt, you have no liquidity. This is the playbook for 21st century economic warfare. The United States brings the military force to the table, and Europe provides the financial strangulation. Combined, they create a system where any form of resistance becomes economically untenable. For the elites in Venezuela, this is